You know, there are moments in history when a conflict suddenly changes direction. Not gradually, not quietly, but in a way that forces everyone watching to stop and ask a new question. And tonight may be one of those moments. Because in the past few hours, Iran has taken a step that many analysts had been warning about for days. A response that signals this conflict may be entering a far more dangerous phase. Now, before we jump to conclusions, let's slow down for a moment and look carefully at what just happened. Because when countries respond during a crisis like this, every move sends a message. Sometimes the message is obvious. Other times, the real meaning only becomes clear after you connect several signals together. And that's exactly what analysts around the world are trying to do tonight. The first reports began circulating earlier today. Iranian military sources indicated that a retaliatory action had taken place following the recent escalation in the region. Details were initially limited, and as often happens during moments like this, information came out slowly. But as the hours passed, a clearer picture started to form. What we know now is that Iran's response was not simply symbolic. It was designed to send a signal, not only to Washington and Israel, but to every government watching this situation unfold. And that signal appears to be this: Iran is willing to escalate if it believes the pressure continues to grow. Now, to understand why this moment matters, we have to step back for a second and look at the broader context. For months, tensions in the Middle East have been building. Military movements, diplomatic warnings, intelligence reports, all pointing to a situation that analysts described as increasingly fragile. But until now, both sides had largely stayed within what experts sometimes call the shadow conflict. Actions that apply pressure without triggering a full-scale confrontation. That may be changing. Because when one side launches a visible response, the dynamics of the conflict can shift very quickly. And that brings us to the first signal analysts are watching tonight. It isn't just the fact that Iran responded. Countries respond to pressure all the time. What matters is the type of response and the message it sends about what might come next. And according to several regional observers, this particular move appears designed to demonstrate capability rather than restraint. In other words, it's not simply about retaliation. It's about positioning. Positioning for what could become the next phase of this conflict. But here's where things start to get complicated, because the second signal analysts noticed shortly after the response may be even more important than the first. And it raises a question that many governments around the world are now quietly asking. Was this just a warning, or the beginning of something larger? Now, to understand the first signal analysts are focusing on tonight, we have to look closely at the nature of Iran's response. Because in geopolitical conflicts, the details of an action often matter far more than the headline itself. And according to early reports from regional monitoring groups, Iran's response was calibrated very carefully. It was strong enough to show capability, but also measured enough to avoid triggering an immediate, full-scale regional war. That balance is not accidental. In fact, it reflects a strategy Iran has used before. A strategy designed to communicate power while keeping the door to further escalation slightly open. And that's the first signal analysts noticed. This was not a random or emotional reaction. It appears to have been a calculated move designed to reshape the psychological balance of the conflict. In simple terms, Iran wanted to demonstrate that it still has the ability to respond quickly and forcefully. But it also wanted to avoid crossing a line that would force a massive retaliation, at least for now. And this is where things start to become more complicated. Because while the immediate response captured headlines, analysts were paying attention to something else happening behind the scenes. Military positioning. Satellite imagery and regional intelligence monitoring groups began noticing unusual movements shortly after the response. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger panic, but enough to raise questions. Some air defense systems in the region appeared to shift into higher readiness. Naval activity in key waterways increased slightly, and certain regional bases reportedly began adjusting their defensive posture. Now, individually, none of these developments would necessarily signal a major escalation. But together, they form a pattern. And patterns are what analysts watch most closely during crises like this. Because conflicts rarely escalate in a single dramatic step. More often, they move through phases: pressure, response, positioning. Then, sometimes, a turning point. And according to several security experts, we may now be entering that positioning stage. But the second signal analysts noticed today may be even more significant than the first. Because shortly after Iran's response became public, political messaging from several key capitals began to change. And when political language changes during a crisis, it often means governments are preparing for the possibility that the situation could move in a new direction. The question now is whether that direction leads toward de-escalation or toward a much wider confrontation, and the next signal may give us the first real clue. The second signal analysts began discussing today did not come from the battlefield. It came from the language used by governments. And in international politics, words matter a great deal, sometimes even more than military movements. Because the way leaders describe a situation often reveals how seriously they are taking the possibility of escalation. Within hours of Iran's response becoming public, several officials in Washington, European capitals, and regional governments began using noticeably stronger language. Statements that had previously focused on monitoring the situation started shifting toward warnings about stability and regional security. That change might sound subtle, but in diplomatic terms, it is significant. When governments begin adjusting their public messaging, it usually means internal discussions are already taking place behind closed doors. Discussions about contingency plans, about how far the situation could escalate, and about what options might exist if the conflict spreads. At the same time, energy markets reacted almost immediately. Oil prices began to move upward, reflecting growing concerns that instability in the region could affect supply routes, particularly in areas that are vital to global energy transportation. For decades, the Middle East has remained one of the most strategically sensitive regions in the world when it comes to energy. And even the perception of instability can ripple through global markets. But analysts say the market reaction was not just about oil, it was about uncertainty. Because uncertainty is often the first signal that investors believe a crisis may be entering a new stage. Now, none of this means that a wider war is inevitable. In fact, many conflicts produce moments like this, moments where tensions spike and then slowly settle back down. But the combination of signals we've seen today is what has experts paying such close attention. A military response, unusual defensive positioning, and now, a shift in diplomatic language. When those three elements appear together during a crisis, it often suggests that governments are preparing for multiple possible outcomes. And that brings us to the third signal analysts are watching tonight. Because in situations like this, the most important question is not simply what happened today. It's what the key players decide to do next. And in the coming hours and days, several decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and other regional capitals could determine whether this crisis begins to cool or whether the pressure continues to build. Now we come to the third signal analysts are paying close attention to tonight. And this one may ultimately be the most important of all, because while military responses and political statements can reveal a great deal, the real direction of a conflict is often determined by strategic decisions made quietly behind the scenes. In the hours following Iran's response, attention quickly turned toward Washington, specifically toward how the United States might interpret the message Tehran appeared to be sending. Historically, American responses to regional escalations have followed a familiar pattern. First comes assessment. Military and intelligence officials analyze exactly what happened, what capabilities were used, and what risks may be developing. Then comes signaling. Statements from government officials begin to clarify how Washington views the situation and whether it considers the action a serious escalation or a contained response. And finally comes positioning. Military assets may be adjusted, diplomatic messages delivered, and regional allies consulted about the next steps. Right now, analysts believe the situation may be moving through that second stage. Several officials have indicated that the United States is closely evaluating the implications of Iran's move. At the same time, regional partners are also being consulted. This is a critical moment in any crisis, because coordination between allies often determines whether tensions escalate further or begin to stabilize. But there is another factor that makes this situation especially sensitive: the broader geopolitical environment. In recent years, global power competition has intensified, with several major powers watching developments in the Middle East very closely. That means decisions made during this crisis will not only affect regional security, but could also influence the wider balance of international relations. And that is why analysts say the next 48 to 72 hours may be particularly important. During that window, governments involved in the crisis will be assessing risks, evaluating options, and deciding how far they are willing to go. Some may push for de-escalation. Others may decide that demonstrating strength is necessary to maintain deterrence. Those choices can shape the trajectory of a conflict very quickly. But there is one more element that analysts believe could play a decisive role in what happens next: public perception. Because in modern conflicts, leaders are not only managing military realities, they are also managing domestic expectations, international opinion, and the perception of resolve. If leaders believe backing down could be interpreted as weakness, they may feel pressure to respond more forcefully. And that dynamic can sometimes turn already tense situations into something much larger. Which brings us to the most important question many observers are asking tonight. Are we witnessing a temporary spike in tensions or the early stages of a much broader escalation? At this point, analysts say the situation could move in several different directions, and understanding those possibilities is important because conflicts rarely follow a straight line. Instead, they evolve through a series of decisions made by leaders under pressure. The first scenario experts are discussing is the possibility of controlled de-escalation. In this scenario, both sides send signals of strength, but ultimately decide that a wider war would be too costly. That would mean Iran's response remains limited, and other actors in the region avoid steps that could dramatically expand the conflict. Diplomatic channels, some of which operate quietly even during moments of confrontation, could begin working behind the scenes to stabilize the situation. This kind of outcome has happened before in international crises. Governments demonstrate capability, tensions spike for a short period of time, and then a combination of diplomacy and strategic restraint gradually lowers the temperature. But analysts warn that a second scenario cannot be ignored, and that scenario involves gradual escalation. Not a sudden large-scale war, but a series of retaliatory actions and counter-responses that slowly widen the scope of the conflict. For example, additional strikes, cyber operations, or indirect confrontations through regional partners could increase pressure without triggering a direct confrontation between major powers. This kind of escalation is often more dangerous than people realize because it unfolds slowly. Each side believes it is responding proportionally, but the cumulative effect pushes the conflict into deeper and deeper instability. Then there is the third scenario analysts are carefully considering, and this one concerns the possibility of a broader regional confrontation. Now, to be clear, many experts still believe this outcome remains unlikely. Major powers tend to avoid situations that could spiral completely out of control. But the reason analysts are discussing it tonight is because several of the signals we talked about earlier appear during the early stages of regional crises. Military signaling, diplomatic warnings, economic reactions. When those three things occur together, it can sometimes indicate that governments are preparing for multiple possibilities. And that uncertainty is exactly what the world is watching right now. Because when tensions rise between powerful actors in a strategically sensitive region, the ripple effects rarely stay contained. They can influence global markets, diplomatic relationships, and the security calculations of countries far beyond the immediate conflict zone, which is why many observers say the most important developments may not happen on the battlefield. They may happen in quiet conversations between governments attempting to prevent a dangerous situation from becoming even worse. As we step back and look at the bigger picture, one thing becomes clear. Moments like this are rarely defined by a single event. Instead, they are shaped by a sequence of reactions, decisions, and signals that unfold over time. Iran's response may turn out to be one chapter in a longer story, or it could represent a turning point that analysts will look back on as the moment the conflict entered a new phase. Right now, the reality is that the world is watching closely. Governments are assessing risks, military planners are evaluating potential scenarios, and diplomats are almost certainly working behind the scenes to prevent a dangerous situation from spiraling further out of control. But history has shown that crises often develop in unpredictable ways. Sometimes tensions that appear extremely dangerous begin to ease as cooler heads prevail and diplomatic solutions emerge. Other times, however, small decisions made during moments of pressure can create consequences that no one originally intended. That is why so many experts say the coming days will be critical. The choices made by leaders in Washington, Tehran, and other capitals could determine whether this moment becomes a short-lived spike in tensions or the beginning of a much longer and more serious confrontation. For ordinary people watching these developments unfold, the situation can feel distant and complicated, but the implications of conflicts like this often reach far beyond the immediate region. Energy markets, global trade, diplomatic alliances. All of these factors can be influenced by how major international crises evolve, and that is why analysts continue to study every signal, every statement, and every movement that could hint at what might happen next. Because in international politics, the early signs of change are often subtle. But once those signs begin to appear together, they can signal that the balance of a conflict is starting to shift. So tonight, the question facing policymakers around the world is not simply how to respond to what has already happened. It is how to prevent the next step from becoming something far more dangerous. Whether this crisis stabilizes or escalates will depend on the decisions that are made in the coming hours and days. And as history has shown time and time again, the path chosen during moments like these can shape the course of international relations for years to come. For now, all eyes remain on the region, watching carefully, waiting for the next signal.